morning, everybody. Thank you to Kim for the opportunity to be here in this incredible city. I'd like to address the relationship today between the media and regulators and how it's evolving, especially with new media. The media landscape was once defined by those who worked in newspapers, radio and television. Today, the term media is virtually boundless. An explosion in creativity and innovation has driven wholesale change, and it continues apace. Websites and podcasts proliferate. New media is swamping, challenging, and competing with traditional media as never before. In Australia, we're very fortunate to have websites such as racing.com, RaceNet, I beg your pardon, and Super Racing. In racing, the media, old and new, shapes the perception of participants, including regulators, as never before. There's also another phenomena at foot. The media in this process has morphed from a specialist pursuit to basically anyone with a mobile device, social media account, and an appetite to post videos, words, or images. Invariably, many of these individuals are unregulated and with contrasting values and features, some excellent, some dubious. The technology is amazing. It's the application which remains the challenge. This evolution from regulated and easily identifiable to anonymous and often questionable holds true for racing as much as any other sport, as much as any other pursuit. While there are plenty of positives driving new media, especially Twitter and Facebook and their non-English equivalents, there's a sinister downside. In some cases, there are no filters, no responsibility. As an example, in Australia, in July last year, Australian racing was awash with rumours circulated via this text message, which eventually found its way into mainstream media. This one has been edited for legal reasons. This text migrated through Australian racing community with frightening pace, and, as I said, into mainstream media almost as quickly as it came out. To date, of the multiple threads contained in this text, the only one has emerged as factual and has been dealt with by authorities. But what the message demonstrates, and what is really interesting, is the challenge posed to full-time and accountable journalists to do their jobs without experiencing external pressures such as these. The same is doubly true for the regulators. Every racing journalist in Australia would have received multiple copies of that text, and all of them would have been asked by their superiors to check it out. This underlines the challenge posed to those from journalism's traditional heartland to function as they always have. To be frank, it was a time-consuming and wasteful process and did no one any favours. One of the biggest stories in Australian racing in recent history involved the Aquanita doping scandal. The story was unique on many fronts because none of the participating parties had any reason to discuss it, either formally or informally, with reporters, as various interview and legal processes were properly followed. The case was under investigation for several weeks before the Herald Sun came into possession of the incriminating text messages at the core of the scandal. The text messages ultimately formed the basis of Racing Victoria's successful prosecution of all but one of the accused. The publication of the texts and accompanying stories triggered questions and commentary around how the Herald Sun obtained the information. What's really interesting is how this debate speaks to the competitive nature behind how news stories are broken and how it eventually filters its way, potentially, to the regulator. It also speaks to the challenges from within the media itself, as you can see from this slide. The opinion contained in this slide has also been edited for legal reasons, but the message is clear. To clarify, the Herald Sun did not come into possession of the text from Racing Victoria. It was made clear at the time, and I'm happy to do so again now. But as you can see, the finger pointing endures, and the theme is clear. 2 years on from when that critique was first aired, and I point to putting two and two together and coming up with roughly 4, remains as dangerous and as perplexing as ever. Near enough is never good enough, and the impact on everyone involved is damaging. After 2 separate disciplinary processes, the material published by the Herald Sun was indeed precisely that used to prosecute 7 licensed personnel, with 3 of them, including trainer Robert Smurden, disqualified for life. So how does a journalist break a story? It's a relatively simple process, or at least should be. 5 basic questions sit at the core of every story, and the answers to those questions should be provided quickly and as accurately as possible. And also, there should be a reasoned explanation of the factors behind the event. As Jack mentioned, the motive. The increasingly cluttered media landscape, though, means the rush to be first, rather than an unbreakable commitment to be clear and factual, has claimed many victims and needlessly besmirched the reputations of innocent parties. Unfortunately, it's only getting worse with the proliferation of unregulated new media. In the case of regulators, it does nothing but build pressure. Competition is great. Nobody should shy from it. And I can vouch from a media perspective that it remains the heartbeat of the industry. Put simply, the adrenaline rush of making Deadline with an exclusive has sustained generations of hacks, some of them more famous for other pursuits than stints as reporters. To racing journalists range from form specialists to columnists trading in opinion to newsbreakers. The newsbreakers are those who deal mostly with racing regulators, administrators and participants. The relationship with stewards should be based on trust, transparency and mutual respect. Without any of these 3 qualities, the relationship is doomed, and from experience, happy to say it's a 2-way street that works really well. The challenge for reporters is to balance public interest, accuracy and underlying motives before publishing. By extension, journalists play an important role in helping reinforcing messages around integrity. What's really interesting about this story is the overarching sympathy for a recidivist, a man who showed no hesitation in threatening a steward and others. Some journalists, regardless of sports or whether it's politics, have a tendency to elevate personalities above all else. Indeed, there are still some cycling reporters, as someone who was lucky enough to cover the Tour de France several times, who argue Lance Armstrong is the greatest thing to ever happen to their sport, and to this day that endures. Once positioned atop these pedestals, sports and racing figures, including trainers and jockeys, can assume a dangerous air of infallibility. In Australian racing, there are a few bigger names than Darren Weir. Darren Weir is currently serving a 4-year disqualification over possession of jiggers. He's in the process of being dealt with by the courts for alleged animal cruelty offences. At his peak, when he trained almost 500 winners in a season, a Melbourne Cup winning trainer, Weir commanded the unchallenged respect of those around him, including the media. Towards the end of 2018, those relationships began to fray. At the time, we didn't know why. In August 2018, the Herald Sun fielded a call from Weir. This is another example of the challenges from within. He was in Darwin and upset at a story regarding Cougar Express's victory in the Grand National Hurdle the previous day. By way of disclosure, Weir didn't train the horse, but he was involved in the inquiry. His horse ran second. Long story short, we agreed to disagree, despite Weir's contention that the stewards didn't know what they were doing. And there was also the accusation that I was obsessed with racing integrity. He was right. I am obsessed with racing integrity. It needs to be racing's gold standard. Without it, we can't succeed. What was really interesting, just from these conversations, was what became clear was the contempt Weir and others held towards authority. And it's part of a cultural problem Racing Victoria and others have quickly addressed and continue to do so. The racing obsession Weir was referring to, by the way, was the Aquanita matter. He felt it had been overplayed and there was essentially a storm in a teacup. The suspicion at the time was that Weir was being overly sensitive to stories relating to integrity, much as Lance Armstrong had been during the tail end of his career. In January last year, we had a better understanding, perhaps, of why Weir would take the trouble to ring journalists, not just myself, to express his disgust over the Cougar Express story. The same story was carried in almost identical form in rival outlets. These same stories centred on integrity. It was no coincidence that everyone got these phone calls. While I'm not surprised by the level of residual empathy some in the industry have for Weir, I must say I was not totally prepared for the puerile threats made against myself and other journalists for reporting facts. They don't bear repeating here. Some owners simply do not believe what has been done with Darren Weir is fair. They believe he's a victim of his own success and a vendetta. It's an interesting concept in light of what is before the courts at the moment. For all that, there was never a time when myself or any of my colleagues were given instructions on how to cover the case. The Weir and the Aquanita story spoke for themselves. The Nikolic story also speaks for itself. As a lifelong racing participant and as someone who always loved the sport from the days of attending rural meetings throughout South Australia with my parents, it's never easy confronting negative racing stories. But as John explained, they provide tremendous traction with the public and with our editors. Trite to say it in the light of that, for racing to prosper, it needs to be clean and it needs more stories such as last Saturday's CS Hayes Stakes at Flemington. The alligator blood and catalyst clash lived up to its billing. These are the races that make the sport, and on a day when the mighty Black Caviar was on course, Flemington delivered a timely reminder of racing's immense power. To be strong, racing needs to be relevant. More than anything, it needs to rid itself, I beg your pardon, of those who threaten its reputation and its future. It's impossible without the relentless pursuit of integrity, and it's crucial that journalists relay that message and that regulators deliver it. The stewards are at the front line of industry integrity. They have the responsibility to ensure proper practices are followed and that integrity and trust are paramount. The relationship with journalists and vice versa ultimately helps shape that message. Resources in some situations do not allow journalists to access information. In some jurisdictions, it's impractical to open stewards' hearings to the media simply because there are far too many journalists on the ground, on site to be accommodated. In other jurisdictions, there are challenges around multiple languages, which prevent media from attending inquiries. Ultimately, transparency must be achieved, notwithstanding the overriding obligation regulators and journalists must hold towards privacy. Privacy, no matter how salacious the case, must be strictly observed, and this is an area where stewards must never be placed under pressure. In Seoul, 2 years ago at the 37th Asian Racing Conference, the Honourable Judge Jack Forrest said, reputational damage affects all aspects of racing. Interests in breeding, selling and purchasing thoroughbreds is also potentially stifled by dishonourable conduct in breach of the rules. Accordingly, it's critical that racing organisations and stewards not only operate within the industry, but be seen by the public at large to do so. Outside of industry-sourced media units, by far the most effective way to transmit that message is via established brands, including newspapers, radio, television and websites. The best way of handling these matters is by being proactive. Nothing enrages editors quite so much as the arrival of a bad news story at 7 p.m. on a Friday. Best to be on the front foot with that. Political parties of all hues have practiced the dark art of burying negative stories for centuries. Traditional media outlets exist on two main revenue streams, advertising and subscription. Of the two, subscriptions are easier to manage, but far less lucrative than the rivers of gold flowing from advertisers. The Herald Sun, the newspaper I work for in Melbourne, is fortunate to have a strong relationship with the 3 racing codes, including Racing Victoria, and the TAB, Australia's preeminent wagering operator. The Herald Sun publishes form guides every day based on an arrangement with the racing codes and the TAB. As Australia's largest newspaper, we've never come under any kind of pressure from any of those groups to publish certain stories or to adopt a particular political stance. Journalists and administrators shouldn't blame stewards for becoming disinclined to communicate if unnecessary pressures are exerted or if confidences are betrayed. Stewards are one of the few groups of officials in any sport across the world that I can think of or have covered who have running communication throughout an event with journalists. It doesn't happen in tennis or the various rugby codes, the various football codes, but in Australia, stewards remain at the behest of reporters. It's a privilege that should never be abused, and it's a connection that requires work, patience, and understanding, even when hard questions are asked. Finally, the shared goal between regulators and stewards should be that transparency is not only achieved, but is seen to be achieved. Transparency through judiciary, transparency through editorial accuracy. Thank you.